The boy in the NASA hoodie had the window seat, his head full of aircraft diagrams. By the end of the flight, everyone would know his name. Though they didn't know it yet, they were already judging him. Micah Taylor, just 15, was flying solo for the first time. But this would be a journey that would challenge not just his ability, but the assumptions others had about him. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary flight was about to set the stage for a confrontation no one expected. The boy in the NASA hoodie had the window seat and a head full of diagrams. By the end of the flight, everyone would know his name. Micah Taylor settled into the seat, a small, quiet thrill running through him as he placed his well-worn sketchpad on his lap. The world outside the aircraft window was still dark just before dawn. Frost clung to the glass in delicate patterns, the kind that looked like they belonged in a museum. He pressed his finger against the cold pane, tracing the icy veins, lost in thought. His mind was already in the clouds, navigating the airspace where the diagrams in his sketchpad seemed to come to life. "Can I get a photo of you in the seat?" His mother's voice echoed softly in his mind, distant but ever present. "You don't have to be loud to be seen, but never shrink for their comfort." It was a sentiment Micah had carried with him for as long as he could remember. His mother was always careful with her words, precise in how she measured her thoughts. It was a lesson he would never forget, especially now, on his first solo flight. He didn't need anyone to look at him, but he would make sure they noticed. The early morning hum of the airport buzzed in the background, passengers moving around with a hurried, excited energy. The Thanksgiving rush was in full swing at Hartsfield-Jackson, the busiest airport in the country, its terminal packed with thick coats and the faint smell of cinnamon coffee lingering in the air. Micah's eyes flickered to the boarding pass in his hand as he folded it up carefully, making sure it didn't get wrinkled. A flight attendant passed by him, her smile quick but polite. Katie, that was her name, he remembered from the gate. She was young, probably a little older than he was, but she had a slight nervousness to her movements. Micah, ever the observer, noticed how she hesitated, her eyes lingering on him just a fraction longer than necessary. He didn't mind, though. He didn't mind much at all these days, even if it did make him feel like an oddity in the room. The boarding process was almost finished now, and the cabin was starting to fill with people, most of them older, families and couples who didn't seem to understand why someone so young was sitting alone in an emergency row. But Micah had been chosen for the seat. The fact that he was trusted with the responsibility made his chest swell a little with pride. He wasn't just any passenger. He was prepared. He took the safety card from the seat in front of him and began studying it, eyes scanning the diagrams of the door latches. His fingers traced the shapes of the levers and buttons, mentally rehearsing the steps it would take to open the door in an emergency, even though he was sure he'd never have to. Ms. Eleanor Voss, an older woman in the seat beside him, glanced over at him with a curious smile. "Engineer in training?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a knowing warmth. Micah chuckled, lifting his eyes briefly. "I wish," he muttered, then shrugged, not sure if he should say more. She nodded, as if satisfied with the brief answer, but Micah could tell she wasn't really asking about engineering. She was just trying to make him feel like he belonged. The cabin was now almost full. People shuffled in, pushing their carry-ons into the overhead bins, greeting friends, finding their seats. But Micah wasn't focused on them. He wasn't focused on anything, except the planes, the lines, the neat mathematical order of the world that only made sense when viewed from above. Then, as if on cue, a flight attendant walked past again. He glanced up, and their eyes met for a brief moment. She lingered just a second too long. Micah noticed the quick flick of her eyes, her brow furrowing slightly. But he didn't speak, didn't flinch. He'd been in situations like this before. Too many eyes on him, assessing, judging, always making their own conclusions. This was no different. Katie returned a few moments later, her steps quiet. She paused beside Micah's seat, checking his boarding pass one more time, the same polite smile barely masking the suspicion in her gaze. Nothing alarming, nothing out of place, yet something felt off. Micah could feel it. He didn't look like the usual pick for the emergency row, did he? He wasn't dressed like the typical business travelers or the families that often sat there. He wasn't a first-class ticket holder, not like the others who would be treated with courtesy and respect from the moment they stepped on the plane. But Micah wouldn't shrink. He'd never let them make him shrink. A voice cut through the air, firm and authoritative, and completely unfamiliar. "Is there a reason this seat hasn't been reassigned yet?" The words hung in the air for a second too long, slipping between the passengers like an unwanted draft. Micah's heartbeat quickened, his chest tightening. He couldn't see the person speaking, but the tone left no room for doubt. The question wasn't a question at all. It was a demand. The eyes of the cabin seemed to shift toward him, then toward the aisle. The air felt colder suddenly, heavier. Micah's hand tightened around his sketch pad as he stared ahead, forcing himself to breathe through the tightness in his throat. Cassie Morgan didn't like gray areas. She especially didn't like teenagers in exit rows. The moment she stepped into the aisle, her gaze locked onto Micah, who sat with a quiet confidence that only teenagers seemed to possess. He didn't belong there, not in Cassie's eyes. And when you've worked in the cabin long enough, you start to spot the ones who shouldn't be there, even if the rules say otherwise. Micah Taylor, with his oversized NASA hoodie and sketchpad, wasn't the type she expected to see sitting in the emergency exit row. He didn't look the part, didn't carry himself like the others. She moved closer, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Her polished uniform and strict demeanor made her a figure that most passengers didn't want to cross. When she reached Micah's seat, she stopped, towering over him like a judge about to deliver a verdict. "You're supposed to be in the exit row," Cassie said, her tone matter-of-fact, cold. She tilted her head slightly. "How old are you, son?" Micah blinked, slightly taken aback by the question. He hadn't been expecting a challenge. "I'm 15, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Cassie nodded, but her lips were thin, pressed tight. She glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, then looked up again, her gaze unyielding. "How did you end up in this row?" Micah swallowed, his mind racing. "I was assigned here by the gate agent," he said, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. He shifted in his seat, trying to explain, but Cassie wasn't listening. She didn't care. "Per FAA Code 14 CFR, Section 121.585, she said, her words sharp as she recited the legal jargon. "Only passengers who meet the requirements are allowed here. You don't look like you meet the criteria." Micah felt his chest tighten. He wanted to protest, to explain that this wasn't a mistake, but the words felt stuck. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Some people won't care about your credentials. They'll only see what they've already decided." Cassie had already decided what kind of person he was, someone who didn't belong in that seat. Katie, the flight attendant, lingered a few steps away, her nervous eyes flicking between Cassie and Micah. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable, but unsure of how to intervene. The other passengers seemed to sense the tension building, some of them glancing up from their books or smartphones. The noise of the cabin quieted just slightly, a collective hush that could be felt in the air. Cassie continued, her voice barely louder than a whisper but still carrying that same authoritative tone. "Please step into the aisle. You'll be reseated." Micah felt a wave of frustration rise within him, but he kept his face blank, his hands gripping the edges of his sketch pad. He could feel the eyes on him, the unspoken judgment in the air. He knew he couldn't argue. He wasn't the kind of person who caused a scene. He stood up slowly, his backpack slung over one shoulder, making sure his movements were calm, deliberate. His jaw clenched, but he didn't say a word. He walked down the aisle toward the front of the plane, knowing that every step he took was being scrutinized. There was no argument, no defiance, just silence. But that silence was heavy. Everyone felt it, the quiet injustice of it all. Katie watched him go, her eyes wide, but she didn't stop him. Her feet shifted nervously, as if she were struggling with a decision she couldn't make. Ms. Voss, seated a few rows behind Micah, observed the scene with calm eyes, her face betraying nothing. She had been watching carefully, more so than anyone might have expected from a retired teacher. She was used to reading people, and right now, she was reading Cassie, reading Micah. And she didn't like what she saw. As Micah moved to follow Cassie, Ms. Voss's hand slipped into her bag. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as she hit the record button. The subtle click of her phone being activated was barely audible over the hum of the cabin, but it was enough. Micah didn't see her, didn't know she was recording the moment, but someone had to bear witness to what was happening. The passengers in the cabin seemed to settle back into their seats, but the air felt different now. It was thick with a quiet tension. Katie couldn't help but glance at the elderly woman behind her, unsure of what to do. Ms. Voss, who had never spoken a word to Micah, now seemed to have silently chosen her side. The flight attendant, Cassie, continued down the aisle, her heels clicking with authority. She had done what needed to be done, in her eyes. She had restored order, enforced the rules. Micah, who hadn't said a word in protest, was just a teenager who didn't belong where he was. But the injustice wasn't being shouted. It was folded into Cassie's clipped sentences and polite smiles. The kind of injustice that doesn't demand loud protests, but quietly settles into the heart, eating away at the fairness you thought the world would offer. Micah stood on the jet bridge, a draft licking at his sneakers. Inside, his seat sat empty, and everyone had seen why. The cold air outside cut through the thin fabric of his hoodie, making him shiver slightly, but it wasn't the chill that made his body stiff. His feet felt heavy as he stared at the ground, his eyes locked on his sneakers, avoiding the gaze of the other passengers who watched him like he was some kind of spectacle. His seat, 14F, was inside, waiting for him, but the flight wasn't moving forward, not yet. The door had been closed, but not for long. Everyone knew now, and Micah couldn't stop the memory of it. He hadn't said a word, not one word in protest. He hadn't fought, he just stood there, frozen. A memory flitted across his mind, uninvited, like all the others today. He was a child, barely 10 years old, standing in front of a table covered with science fair projects. His design had been ignored. The judges walked right past it, glancing over the crude drawings and the little homemade gadgets he had worked on for weeks. He'd looked at the floor then, too, just like now, and then his mother had stepped in. Micah could almost hear her voice, calm and quiet in the background, as she pinned her name badge on his chest. "Sometimes respect arrives late," she had said. But it always came, didn't it? He squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the soft scratch of his sneakers against the concrete as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't going to cry. He wasn't going to let anyone see how much it hurt. He couldn't. Not now. Inside the plane, the atmosphere had shifted from the busy chaos of boarding to something quieter, heavier. Passengers were settled into their seats, murmuring softly to each other. But the tension was thick, and Micah could feel it even from the jet bridge. There were eyes on him, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Cassie stood at the gate, her tone cold, giving orders to the gate agent. "Verify eligibility," she said, the words clipped. Frozen. Her back was stiff, her arms crossed, looking more like someone preparing for an interrogation than someone just doing their job. Verify eligibility. The words echoed in Micah's head, and he could hear the subtle disdain underneath. He didn't belong here. Not really. Micah didn't look up. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even sure if he could anymore. His hands gripped the edges of his hoodie as he stayed as still as possible. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, but it felt like an eternity. His heart pounded, but there was a strange calmness to his body. It was like he had learned to shut off everything else, except for the quiet beating in his chest. Inside the cabin, Ariana Taylor, his mother, sat in first class, watching quietly. Her fingers were tapping against the armrest, a subtle sign of agitation, but she remained calm, just as Micah had learned from her over the years. She hadn't spoken, hadn't stood up yet, but Micah could feel her watching, even though he couldn't see her. A text appeared on her phone, and she glanced down at it without reacting. Whatever it said, it didn't show on her face, but something had shifted in her posture. The way she held her phone, the subtle tensing of her fingers. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. Katie, the young flight attendant, glanced nervously toward the cockpit, her eyes darting between Cassie and Micah. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, uncertain. The newness of her job still felt too big for her to handle. She had been polite to a fault, but now she was starting to question the authority in front of her. She whispered to a senior attendant, "This doesn't feel right." Ms. Eleanor Voss, who had been quietly observing everything, didn't move. She hadn't spoken a word, but her phone was resting in her lap. She wasn't a participant in this drama, not in the traditional sense. She wasn't angry. She wasn't fuming. But she was aware. And when she raised her phone just slightly, tilting it to capture the scene before her, it was clear that she had been here before, just not on a plane. Her experience told her that there was something wrong here. Cassie turned to the gate agent and spoke again, her words crisp. "We've removed the passenger, requesting clearance to close doors." The words were a simple directive, but they carried weight. This was it. This was the moment. Micah stood motionless on the jet bridge. He could hear the hum of the plane's engine, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. He wasn't part of the group. Not now, not here. Katie looked back to the cockpit again, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Her nerves were eating at her, but she didn't know what to do. Micah hadn't caused any problems. He hadn't done anything wrong. But Cassie had decided. As Micah turned to follow Cassie toward the front of the plane, there was a subtle shift in the air. The quiet tension that had been thickening with every passing second had reached its peak. And then a voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through the silence, the words like a command. "Executive personnel will be joining us momentarily. Please hold the door." The voice was calm, but its authority couldn't be mistaken. It wasn't Cassie anymore. It wasn't the flight attendants. It was someone else entirely, someone who was stepping in to handle the situation. And for Micah, it felt like the beginning of something he wasn't sure he could control. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even turn her head. But the moment Ariana Taylor stood, the cabin fell into stillness. It wasn't the kind of silence that followed a dramatic outburst. It wasn't the kind that came with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. No, this was a stillness that wrapped around every person in the room like a blanket. It was as if the entire aircraft held its breath in collective anticipation. Passengers, who had once been shuffling in their seats, now sat rigid. Micah could feel it in the air. Something was about to change. Ariana's movement was calm, deliberate. Her heels made no sound against the carpeted floor of the cabin, but every step she took was filled with quiet authority. She walked past rows of passengers who, for the first time, seemed to recognize the weight of her presence. Heads turned, not in surprise, but in the way people instinctively shift their gaze towards someone who commands respect. Ariana didn't care for the attention. She wasn't walking to make a statement, but to make a point. And the point was clear to anyone watching. She stopped in front of Cassie Morgan, who stood near the cockpit, trying to maintain her composure. Cassie's stance, once unwavering, now seemed a bit less certain. She forced a smile, but Ariana didn't return it. There was no need. Ariana's face was still, composed, as always. But beneath that stillness was something else, something deeper. It was the quiet power that had built her career from the ground up. "Explain," Ariana said, her voice low but firm. In front of these passengers, why a ticketed miner was removed from his seat. Cassie's smile faltered as she quickly regained her composure. "Policy," she said, her voice stiff with the attempt to justify herself. Ariana didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her wallet, her movements slow and deliberate. The soft rustle of leather was the only sound for a moment. Then, she pulled out her CEO badge, its gold emblem gleaming in the dim light of the cabin. The badge wasn't just an identification. It was a weapon, one that didn't need to be brandished. Katie, who had been standing slightly behind Cassie, gasped. Her eyes widened as the realization hit her. She had no idea who this woman was, but now the tension in the air felt like it had just reached a boiling point. The first officer appeared in the cockpit doorway, his eyes scanning the situation but saying nothing. He too seemed to understand that something monumental was about to unfold, but he remained silent, as if waiting for someone else to speak first. Ariana turned to Cassie. "Explain," she repeated, her voice unwavering, "why a ticketed miner was removed from his seat." Cassie opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. The silence in the cabin stretched longer, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for her to crack. But Ariana didn't give her the chance. She stepped forward and locked eyes with the flight attendant, her gaze piercing and sharp. "I'm the CEO of this airline," she said, her tone still steady but carrying the weight of her position. "And I don't take kindly to this kind of behavior." The entire cabin held its breath. Cassie blinked, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is about policy, the rules," she stammered, but Ariana cut her off with a sharp gesture. Ariana turned, her movements deliberate and controlled, to face the cockpit. The entire cabin seemed to freeze in place as she addressed the pilot. "This aircraft is grounded. Effective immediately," she said, her voice carrying an undeniable finality, "until a personnel reassessment is conducted." The pilot, still standing in the cockpit doorway, didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face unreadable. Cassie's voice broke through the silence, barely a whisper. "You were on the manifest?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. Ariana didn't flinch. She turned her head slightly toward Cassie, her expression still composed, and replied with simple clarity, "I wrote the manifest." The weight of her words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The entire cabin, which had once felt like a place of tension and uncertainty, now seemed like a courtroom, and Ariana was the silent judge. No one dared to speak. No one moved. Even the flight attendants, who had been so eager to follow orders just moments before, now stood frozen, as if they were waiting for the next command. Micah stood just inside the cabin door, watching in silence. His breath was shallow, but he didn't smile, didn't move. He just breathed, the sound of his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Cassie stood motionless, her composure shattered. For the first time, she seemed unsure of herself. The badge, Ariana's CEO badge, had stripped her of the authority she thought she had. She tried to regain some control, but the words didn't come. Ariana didn't move. She was still. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence spoke louder than anything she could have said. And in that moment the cabin understood. The plane didn't move. But everything else did. Micah sat silently in seat 14F, his posture stiff, jaw clenched. The world outside the window was hidden behind a thick fog, but inside a shift had occurred, slow, subtle, but undeniable. His gaze flicked to the aisle, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the armrest. Around him, the rest of the cabin was alive with murmurs and restless shifting. No one spoke directly to him, but the change was palpable. The tension was still there, but something new was taking shape, something quieter, more insidious, yet brimming with consequence. Ariana sat back in her seat, calm as ever, her fingers moving deftly across her tablet. The soft hum of the aircraft systems was the only sound that competed with the growing noise from the passengers. She was the still center of the storm. To the untrained eye, she was just another passenger, her focus entirely on the screen in front of her, but Micah knew better. He could feel the presence of her authority, even from across the cabin. Cassie, however, was different. She was standing now, her posture stiff and unnatural, her face a shade lighter than usual. She kept glancing toward the cockpit, as if seeking a way out. Her eyes flickered toward Micah, and for a moment, he thought she might try again. Another explanation, another attempt to assert herself. But when her gaze met his, he offered nothing in return. His silence was more powerful than any words he could have said. Katie, standing behind Cassie, seemed less afraid to shift her stance. She had once been uncertain, but now she was watching the scene unfold with something closer to resolve. Her hands were folded in front of her, but the unease had disappeared from her face. She no longer seemed like a passive player caught in the whirlwind. Her eyes met Ariana's for a fleeting moment before she turned back to Micah. She didn't speak, but the understanding between them was clear. Ms. Voss, meanwhile, was no longer just a passive observer. She had become the unexpected chorus of the audience. Her phone was in hand, fingers tapping rapidly. She was uploading the footage from the cabin to whatever platform she had in mind. The caption she typed quickly flashed onto the screen. The boy they tried to move, the mother who moved them. It was a simple statement, but it spoke volumes. No words necessary. Ariana's phone buzzed, but she didn't check it immediately. She only took a moment to breathe, her face neutral as she tapped the screen of her tablet once more. When the flight attendant in the aisle walked past her, Ariana's fingers hovered over the screen. With a soft exhale, she pressed the button, sending the message. In the meantime, Cassie had moved toward Micah. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words stuck. "We misunderstood," she began, but Micah didn't respond. His lips pressed tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't need to say anything. Everything was already being said by his refusal to acknowledge her. Cassie seemed to deflate slightly, but she wasn't ready to back down. Her gaze flickered to the cockpit again, and she straightened herself as if to gather the last remnants of control. She didn't want to back down, but the moment had passed. Her voice no longer held the same power. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a slight delay due to senior airline review. We apologize for the inconvenience." The murmurs in the cabin increased. The passengers' frustration was apparent, but so was something else, something that was beginning to feel like solidarity. There were some who grumbled, but there were others who, Micah noticed, were nodding. The tension wasn't just about the delay. It was about the situation in the cabin, the way something had shifted. And then, without hesitation, Ms. Voss began to clap. It started as a quiet, solitary sound, but soon enough, others joined in. Katie glanced over at her, and her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't stop her. In fact, Katie's hand went to the arm of the seat, as if she were waiting for a moment of release. a way to break free from the oppressive atmosphere. The passengers, now awake to the pulse of solidarity running through the cabin, began to murmur in approval. Micah couldn't help but watch. His heart beat a little faster, but the weight of the moment settled in the pit of his stomach. The silence spoke volumes. It was louder than anything he could say. Ariana's phone pinged again. The notification lit up the screen for everyone to see. The words, "Northwind Airways, zero tolerance for profiling, immediate personnel review underway," flickered across the screen, too big to ignore. The message wasn't just for Cassie, it was for everyone. It was a statement of power, of consequence, and it reverberated through the cabin like a silent declaration of war. Cassie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, but she didn't make any movement toward the intercom. She kept her gaze fixed ahead. Ariana glanced at the intercom as well, but she didn't move to use it. Instead, she stood up. The slight shift in her posture was enough to send the cabin into another tense silence. Micah glanced over, his pulse steady as Ariana finally closed her tablet and locked eyes with Cassie. It wasn't an angry stare. It was calm, measured, and held no emotion. And yet, it felt like the entire cabin held its breath. "You're no longer in control of this cabin," Ariana said simply, the weight of the statement hanging in the air. Cassie's face flushed. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't find the words. It was too late now. The weight of the truth had descended on her, and she couldn't deny it. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke. The tension was as thick as the fog outside, and it clung to the cabin like a heavy blanket. Ariana's stillness, her calm demeanor, was all that was left. The plane hadn't moved, but the course of the flight had shifted entirely. Micah boarded the same plane again, but this time, the aisle felt like a victory march. The gate agent didn't ask to see his boarding pass. No one stopped him. No one questioned his right to be there. He walked down the jet bridge with a steady pace, his sneakers making quiet tapping sounds on the metal floor. Each step was more deliberate than the last. As he approached the cabin door, he couldn't help but let the faintest smile touch his lips. His seat, 14F, was just ahead. The same seat. But it was different now. It wasn't a place of accusation or doubt anymore. It was his. Ariana Taylor followed behind him, her presence a silent anchor. She didn't rush, didn't hurry. She simply moved with the confidence of someone who knew what was right and had fought for it. Her footsteps matched his, steady, measured, almost in sync. Micah didn't need to look back to know she was there. She had always been there, even when he couldn't see her. The weight of her support settled in his chest, and for the first time today, he exhaled fully. Katie, the flight attendant, greeted him with a warmth that hadn't been there before. The usual polite smile was replaced with something more genuine, something that spoke of understanding. "Seat 14F's ready for you," she said. Micah nodded, his throat tight but his chest full. He stepped into the aisle and made his way toward his seat. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, but they weren't the same eyes. They weren't filled with suspicion or judgment now. They were different, respectful, curious, some even apologetic. Micah clicked his seatbelt in place, slowly, deliberately, as if the action had become a ritual. He was used to fastenings now, used to being in control of what he could, even when everything else felt uncertain. The tightness of the strap felt like the last vestige of all the tension, the anger, the frustration he'd held onto before. Ariana slid into her seat beside him, her gaze sweeping across the cabin, acknowledging everything and nothing all at once. She was discreet, her presence only truly felt by the people who mattered. She didn't need to announce her authority anymore. It was there, in the way she moved, in the quiet but certain energy she gave off. Katie passed by again, pausing for just a second as she caught Micah's eye. Her smile this time was softer, warmer, filled with something Micah hadn't noticed before. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe understanding. She glanced at her phone as she passed, and Micah could see the faintest spark of recognition. The video had already made its rounds. The headline flashed across his mind. He just wanted to fly. Ms. Voss's video had gone viral, 1.8 million views. Micah tried to ignore it, but it was impossible not to notice the subtle shift in the air, the way the murmurs had grown into a hum of approval that didn't seem to dissipate. It was too late now to take it back. The passengers, those who had witnessed his humiliation and those who hadn't, were all becoming part of the story. Micah didn't look at his phone. He didn't need to. He knew what had happened. He knew how the world had shifted in his favor, and, For once, it didn't matter if they knew his name. He was already taking back what had been stolen. The plane began to taxi, slowly at first, and Micah's pulse picked up. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, almost as if in time with the aircraft's movement. Ariana turned to him, her eyes soft with something like pride. She leaned over, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "Next time, you're flying it," she whispered. He blinked, processing her words. The gravity of them didn't sink in immediately. It was too much to take in all at once. But the simple thought of it, of him, Micah Taylor, one day behind the controls, made something shift inside him. For a second, everything fell away, and all that was left was the horizon in front of him. There was a place for him. There was always a place for him. As the plane reached the runway, the engines roared to life, and the force of the takeoff pressed him back into his seat. Micah didn't brace himself. Instead, he leaned into the sensation, letting it sweep him away. The cabin rumbled, and the ground beneath them disappeared, but Micah didn't feel fear. He felt something else, something rooted in the way the air shifted as they climbed higher. The altitude wasn't just a measure of distance, it was a symbol. It was the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. The plane leveled out, and Micah's gaze turned toward the window. The mist and fog had been replaced by a clear view of the sky. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, a little older, a little steadier. His shoulders didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. And his expression, when it finally softened into a smile, didn't feel like something he was forcing. It was a smile that belonged to him now. The journey wasn't over. But the destination, for the first time, felt within reach. Micah sat back in his seat, the hum of the plane a steady presence around him. His reflection in the window wasn't just his face anymore. It was the face of someone who had fought, silently and without fanfare, and had won. His journey wasn't about the seat he'd earned, but about the dignity reclaimed, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or judged by appearances. In life, we often wait for our worth to be recognized, but sometimes respect isn't given, it's earned. Micah's quiet strength had shown that justice doesn't need to roar, it only needs to be patient and unyielding. The world may judge by what it sees, but Micah had proven that what's inside, the resilience and the courage to stand, speaks louder. If this story resonates with you, perhaps it's time to pass on that warmth to others, to remind them they too can stand in their truth.